Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Pei Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by an anonymous donor for the safety of our chayalim, the recovery of those wounded, and for the safe and speedy return of the hostages. We are going to get started. Quick announcements. The journey to Rosh Hashanah is on its way, and if you had any technical issues, just reach out to us. Just basically follow the instructions and make sure you're registered and enrolled for the course, and then you will get all the notifications and access to the shiurim. Also, I will be in Riverdale for Shabbat speaking. So if anybody knows people there or lives there, wants to come hear me, you can write to me. I'll give you the details by email or WhatsApp. And Zoom will take a break starting from this Friday through until Rosh Hashanah. And on Sunday of the week before Rosh Hashanah, all the dapim will be posted. If you get our links, then we'll send the links to you. We'll send it out to the WhatsApp groups. If you're not part of our WhatsApp groups and you don't get the links, we'll probably send them out by MailChimp, also by the email. If you don't get them and you want them, just reach out to us and we'll send you the links, because they won't be up on the site, so as not to confuse everyone. It'll still be the day of until Wednesday of Rosh Hashanah, but they will all be up on the site, and we can gladly send you links if you need. Okay, that's enough for announcements. We're going to get started. We are in the middle of this topic of the 3 trees. So I buy 3 trees, I get the land underneath, but there's obviously a lot of criteria in order for this to happen. So the issue we're grappling with right now is how much space in between each tree. Okay, soon we're going to get to toward the end of the daf of what's the formation of the trees. Are they in a row? Are they in a triangle formation? We kind of visualized it as if they were sort of in a triangle, circular kind of space, but we'll see there's actually a debate about that. But now we're talking about how much space in between the trees. In order for it still to be considered, the reason I acquired the land is because we view it as a field. So what better sources to bring than kilayim when we're talking about what is it considered a vineyard? How much space in between rows makes it a vineyard? Both, we're going to have to talk about the minimum and the maximum. So until now, the sugya talked about minimum and maximum. We have 2 opinions of what Shmuel said. Okay, they're passed down by someone who passed down from Shmuel. Okay, we have Rav Nachman, who quoted, I have to see it. We have Rav Yosef, who quoted Rav Yehuda, who quoted Shmuel. And then we have Rav Nachman, who quoted Shmuel directly. Okay, so Rav Yosef, so I said it wrong. It wasn't each person. Oh, right, sorry. It was Rava who quoted Rav Nachman, who quoted Shmuel. So we have these 2 different opinions. It's interesting that Rava is passing down Rav Nachman's statement in the name of Shmuel. We really call it Rav Nachman, probably because later in the sugya, all of a sudden, Rava is going to bring a 3rd opinion. But right now, we're quoting opinions of what Shmuel thought, and perhaps that's why Rava comes in only later, because he's quoting he has a 3rd opinion. Here, it's really 2 opinions of what Shmuel actually held. So either he said minimum 4 cubits of distance between each tree, maximum 8, or according to Rav Nachman, minimum 8, maximum 16. Now, the source we brought yesterday, which was brought by Abaye to say to Rav Yosef, why don't you hold like Rav Nachman? Because look at this Mishna, really only talks about the maximum, which is the 16. And it basically showed that if there's 16 cubits empty between vines, right? Remember the guy turned his vines that way and turned them that way so that there was total space of 16 free, then it's not a vineyard. And then you can plant in that in-between space with only leaving 1 cubit on the side, as opposed to if it was a vineyard, you'd have to leave 4 cubits. So that was a good proof for Rav Nachman. Here comes Rav Yosef's response. Amarle, very bottom of Pei Ben Amud Bet, Anale Adana, I don't know what I didn't know that source, which is a little strange. You didn't know Mishna, but okay, I don't know. But Ela Uvda Hava Bedura de Ravata, but there was a city of shepherds. We've had this before. I meant to look up, I didn't have a chance, but look up if as the story we saw last time was the same people quoting it, Rav Yosef about a mikrev, Rav Yehuda. You can look it up on Safaria very easily and search and find out where. I'm pretty sure it was in Bava Batra, if not Bava Metzia. It was not so long ago. But we had a case in a city of shepherds. Anyway, homework for anyone who wants. There was a case in the city of shepherds, Va'atu l'kamei de Rav Yehuda. And they came before Rav Yehuda. Now, it doesn't say what exactly. Okay, there's a lot of these sugyot. I feel like also in Bava Batra specifically, where there's a lot of details missing and there's a lot of different commentaries as to how to understand this. We'll go with the Rashbam, who says, what was the case about? The case was exactly our case. Somebody sold someone 3 trees, and there was, now, it doesn't tell you about the maximum, okay, but they say, and there wasn't 8 cubits between them, okay, because we're going to have to basically say, Rav Yosef used this as his proof, but there's only going to be a discussion of the 4, no discussion of the 8. And he said, Amarle, Zil Havle, and here also there's a sentence that doesn't, by the Rashbam, doesn't read in the simple way it's read. But he said, give him, Rabbi Yehuda said, give the buyer the land in between, okay? And because again, there wasn't 8, and the main thing we're going to say is, Kimelo bakar v'kelav. Now, if you read that sentence straight, it would say, give him the amount of space of Melo bakar v'kelav, but that's not what it means. It means, give him the space, like as if this sentence breaks in the middle. Give him the space in between, all the land in between belongs to the buyer. Why? Because Kimelo bakar v'kelav. Because there's enough space in between them that you could fit the bakar and it's right, the cattle and their and the, what do you call it? They're vessels, but it means, right, they're the equipment. So the word I was looking for. So it has enough space, which is what? Well, the lo havayadana kimelo bakar v'kelav kamen. Now Rav Yehuda tells this, Rav Yosef tells the story about Rav Yehuda who passed in this way. And he said, but when I heard this story, I didn't really know what kimelo bakar v'kelav was. But then, but then I heard this Mishnah that said, Lo yita adam ilan sabuch l'stei chavero, elem kenerchit mimenu arba amot, beginning of our Masechet. Don't plant a tree, remember all those sugyot? Don't plant a tree near your friend's field, unless you distance your tree from the field 4 cubits. Vitane Allah, and then they had a braita on this Mishnah, which said, Arba amot shamru kedei avodat hakeren. Well, the 4 amot they're talking about is in order to work the land. Okay, the vineyard here, but whether vineyard doesn't matter, right? In order to work the land. Va'amina, and then I said to myself, shma mina, we can infer from here, kimelo bakar v'kelav, must be arba amot. Okay, because what is a bakar and kelav if not to work the field? So basically, Rav Yosef says the following. Let's summarize from the beginning. I don't know about your Mishnah you brought, but I have this proof from the story that happened, which is a case that happened with Rav Yehuda later, not Tanaitic time period, this is important, but during the Amoraim time period. Rav Yehuda was 2nd generation. And basically, a guy bought 3 trees. Rav Yehuda said, you get the land underneath because there's at least 4 cubits in between each one. And as the Rashbam added, and there wasn't 8 cubits. And basically that proves you need a minimum of 4 cubits. And he didn't say 4 cubits. He said this term that Rav Yosef didn't know what it was, but then he figured it out based on this Mishnah and the explanation about the Mishnah. And then he realized that's 4 cubits. So that's Rav Yosef's proof. To which the Gemara says, forget about that. Rav Yosef milotznam, but doesn't he have a Mishnah to support him? Okay, Rav Yosef didn't pull out this Mishnah, but there's also a Mishnah to support him. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon omrim, hanotea et karmo, shmona amot, al shmone, mutar lavi zera l'sham. If your vineyard is planted 8 by 8, meaning there's distance of 8 in between each row, you can bring zra'im sham and plant your grains. Again, right, with 1 cubit of distance, but you don't need 4 cubits of distance. So what do you see here? 8 by 8 is the measurement that's fine for, right, for 8 amot of distance would mean separate space, would mean you no longer would acquire all the trees. And that fits with Rav Yosef, 4 to 8, that 8 is the maximum. Okay, it's interesting. The story kind of proved 4, the minimum. And this proves the maximum, the 8. So now if you notice, again, I want to point this out because we're going to also, it's good to point out, and we're going to get to it later, the proof for Rav Nachman was only talking about the 16, the maximum number, not the minimum, right? Because each one has 2 numbers. So basically we're saying, well, if Rav Yosef can prove his opinion from a Mishnah, then this whole question Abaye asked, well, Rav Nachman has a Mishnah to support him is a little bit strange because Rav Yosef also has a Mishnah to support his reading. To which the Gemara says, afilu hachi ma'aseh adif. And this is a principle in general that applies, which is, if there's opinions, okay, that's something. A rabbi has an opinion, that's important. But if the rabbi or the rabbis acted upon the opinion, that is much stronger. Now, it's a little bit tricky because there's two actions here, okay? But what they're going back to is when they're talking about the comparison of the two Mishnayot, both are, by the way, Mishnayot and Kilayim, one is supporting Rav Nachman, one is supporting Rav Yosef. The one that's supporting Rav Nachman is stronger because, if you remember, the Mishnah ended with, the end of yesterday's daf, not only, right, that if you have 16 cubits in between, you can plant the other, the field in between, if you have your rows are separated by 16 cubits. But then Rabbi Yehuda said there was a case of someone who did this, and the rabbi said it was okay. So that already is a big support, okay? And that's stronger than the Mishnah then that supports Rav Yosef's opinion. Not to mention, Rav Yosef's opinion is in the name of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, which means it's minority opinions and not the majority opinion. But here they say Ma'aseh Adif, and this is a principle in general. That's why often the Mishnayot bring stories, because the cases are much stronger precedent builders than the opinions themselves. There's even I like these kind of things. So one of my favorite sugyot is there's a case, and then the rabbis hold some way. I think it was Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish, and then the other rabbis say, but you don't hold that way. And they said, well, just because we hold that way doesn't mean we're going to do a maaseh based on our opinion. In other words, I could think in theory, but I might not necessarily always act upon it. So that's also highlighting the same idea here. Now we're going to ask the following question. Bishlama. If you remember, a Bishlama structure means we're going to say this makes sense and something else doesn't make sense. So Bishlama, the Rav Yosef. Well, Rav Yosef, we understand why, because Aliba to Rabbi Shimon, if he goes according to Rabbi Shimon, both on the minimum and on the maximum. Okay, meaning now they're going to use different words than minimum and maximum. They didn't have those words in their repertoire, but Aliba to Rabbi Shimon Shamina le mefuzarim. We see from Rabbi Shimon how distant, right? In other words, what the maximum distance can be between them. Vishamina le ritzufim, and we also learn the minimum distance, so they're not too crowded that it won't be called a field because it's too crowded and things don't grow well. Mifuzarim. Okay, so now we're going to basically say, according to Rav Yosef, he must be holding like Rabbi Shimon's opinion, both on the minimum and on the maximum. And let's see where. Mifuzarim had amaran. So we just said mifuzarim because we just saw that Rabbi Shimon held a distance between vines is the distance that already we consider this two totally, right? This isn't going to be called a vineyard, which is the same for us. It won't be called a field, and therefore you won't acquire if the trees are distanced too far. What about the minimum? Well, Shamina le ritzufim, ritzufim ditnan. Here's a Mishnah. It's going to show where Rabbi Shimon holds ritzufim. And this is something we actually learned in the beginning of the Masechet and Lamed Zayin, and we're going to learn it coming up in a few weeks on Kuf Bet, the Rosh Hashanah Dapim. Kerem hanatua al pachot me'arba amot eno kerem. If the vines are too close, remember this, if they're planted more than two at a distance of 4 cubits, but there's, let's say, one in the middle or more than one in the middle, one row, that's not a kerem, okay? Because it's not going to grow well. And therefore, we don't call this a kerem. That's divrei Rabbi Shimon. So we could stop right here. You already see. That's what Rabbi Shimon says. In order for it to be considered a field, they can't be too close. And what's too close? 4 cubits. Okay. So that matches. So now we could stop here, but we're not going to because we're going to read the rest of that source. But that Mishnah. But basically what we have here is, again, we have Rabbi Shimon. Rav Yosef holds like Rabbi Shimon across the board. We see where he gets this opinion of the number for the minimum and the number for the maximum. The Chachamim Omrim, again, here we're just continuing along in that source. The rabbis say keren. It is a keren. Even if you have row and then 2 amot another row and 2 amot another row, that's still a vineyard. Rabbi Shimon doesn't consider it. The rabbis do. Why? We view those middle ones as if they're not there because they'll probably uproot them. And therefore, right, since they're not going to grow well anyway, we view them as if they're not really there. And then you have row with a distance of 4, as long as we kind of imagine they're not there. But, okay, so that was just the end of the braita. But here we're back to our Bishlama. So Rabbi Yosef, we understand. He also like Rabbi Shimon, and we see Rabbi Shimon's opinion both about the minimum amount of space required for it to be considered a field and the maximum, because again, as soon as it's considered a field, which would be the same as a vine, but the vine has ramifications for laws of kilaim, and that's why every source they brought about the vines has to do with kilaim, with planting crops nearby. But, and I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. If it's an official vine, then you have to distance 4 cubits, and that's the Isra Midoraita of Kilei HaKerem. If it's not defined as a vine, you still have to distance, but it's not by Torah law, and it's only one cubit. And for our purposes, it's going to mean that if we call this a field, then you acquire the land underneath those 3 trees and a little bit around it. Now we're going to say, Rav Nachman, aliba de Rabbana mefuzarim shamin alei. Now here we go back to what I said before. The source we saw to prove Rav Nachman in Kilaim was the rabbi's opinion, and it only talked about the 16, the maximum. But ritzufin, but if they're crowded together at what, right? What do we consider crowded? Too crowded, that's not going to be a field. Mishamin alei. We don't have any source. Nowhere does it say, and in fact, most of the sources say 4, right? Nowhere does it say that if it's 8 cubits, right, that you need to have an 8 cubits distance for it to be considered a field. Otherwise, they're too close and they won't grow well. So where does he get this from? Which the Gemara answers, Svarahu. It's just logical. What's the logic? Midila Rabbi Shimon Palga, the Rabbananami Palga. Since Rabbi Shimon's numbers are half, right? 8 is the maximum, 4 is the minimum. So Rav Nachman also understood that it was half. And therefore, if it was 16 with the maximum, which he has proof for, then the minimum must be 8. So we would think that the sugya is going to end there. We have machlokes Rav Yosef, Rav Nachman. What Shmuel said, was it 4 to 8 or 8, right? From 8 to 16. Again, it's not really from 4, but right, minimum, well, I guess it is from, right? Minimum of 8 distance, maximum of 16. That's Rav Nachman. And again, Rav Yosef 4 to 8. But now comes Rava, who originally quoted Rav Nachman, who quoted Shmuel. But Rava says, Hilchatame arba amot ad sheshesre. All of a sudden, he says the halakha is from 4 to 16. Okay? Not 4 to 8, not 8 to 16, but the whole range. Minimum 4. Once it's 4 distance, we consider this as a field, as long as they're not 16 cubits away from each other. And then, right, which sounds like he's maybe doing a compromise or something, unclear. But then the Gemara says it's not like Rava just made this up, pulled this out of a hat, which sounds like it from the way we've been learning the sugya. But now they say there's a braita, Tanya Kabate de Rava. There's a braita to support Rava's position. Kama yuhu mekuravim arba amot, kama yuhu meruchakim sheshesrei. Hareza kana karka ve'eta ilanot shebenehem. This braita is not only saying, right, both, but it's talking about our case. Forget about, it's not like kilaim, like all the other sources. This is our case. This is somebody buys 3 trees, and the braita says, how far apart do they have to be? 4 cubits from each other. Until how far? 16. And if so, if you bought these trees and they were somewhere between the range of 4 and 16 cubits away from each other, you acquire the land, and all the trees that might be in that area. I just bought these 3 trees, but there's another bunch of trees in between. They're mine as well. Okay, presumably they mean smaller trees, because if they were bigger trees, then already it would be back to, well, they're blocking this from growing, right? It's not really a field. Lefichach, therefore, yavesh ha'ilan oniktzatz yesh lo karka. Now this braita is giving some ramifications. If I acquire the land, so if the tree dries up, what does that mean? Well, I have the land. I can plant another tree there. Pachot mikan o yeter al kam. But if there's less than that amount of space, less than the 4 cubits, or more than 16, osha lekacham bezer charzer, or another case where this wouldn't work, if I acquire them each in separate transactions. Okay, only if I acquire them all at the same time is it considered that I acquired the land underneath. If I bought 1 tree and then another day bought another tree and then a different time bought a third, that doesn't work. In other words, again, I own all 3 trees, but I don't own the land in between and around them. So I don't get the land underneath and in between, and I don't get the trees that are in between there. And therefore, the opposite is true. Yavesh ha'ilan, if the tree dries up, oniktzatru was cut down, ein lo karka. I don't have anything. I lost my whatever I bought. It's gone. Okay, I'm done and I have to leave. Okay, that was the first section of today's daf, which was to deal with what's the distance between? We ended up with 3 opinions, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, or 4 to 16. Now we're going to go with a slew of questions here. And some of them we'll have answers to, some of them we won't. We're going to start with our favorite question asker, Rabbi Yirmiya. Okay, and in fact, today his questions will actually be answered while others will not be, surprisingly. By Rabbi Yirmiya. Kishehu moded, mimakom katsal hu moded, or mimakom rachav hu moded. Now, sometimes we call his questions nitpicky. On the other hand, he's very practical. You guys are talking up in the air, but I want to know when I go to measure, so a tree is wide at the bottom, gets narrower at the top. So when we measure this 4 and 8 or 16, what we're measuring, are we measuring from the top of the trees where it's narrow, or from the bottom of the trees where it's wide? And obviously we're going to get to different measurements if we go with that or go with that. Amar le Rav Geviha mi beiktil le Rav Ashi. I want you to point out, first of all, it's kind of funny, Rav Geviha about the height, because here we're talking about at what height do we measure. His name is Mr. Tall, okay, Mr. Gavoa. So Rav Geviha from Beiktil, and that was the place he was from, said to Rav Ashi, Rav Yirmiya is living before that and in Israel. And Rav Ashi is in Babylonia at the end of the Kufan HaMoraim. I forget Rav Yirmiya. I forget, but I'm guessing he's like 3rd generation or something, but someone can check for that on me. But he's certainly not in the time of Rav Ashi, and he's certainly not in Babylonia. I mean, he was in Babylonia at some point, but presumably Rav Geviha is answering Rabbi Yirmiya's question later, okay, not to Rabbi Yirmiya, which is interesting because it sounds, you could say maybe nobody really answered Rabbi Yirmiya's questions, because remember, they kicked him out of the Beit Midrash earlier in our Masechet from his questions. And anyway, it's not to say this isn't chronological. It's not to say, oh, he asked this question outside the Beit Midrash when he was kicked out, but it's just to say that we don't know if anyone answered him. But Rav Geviha brings an answer, which is kind of a funny answer, because he's really going to say neither nor. It's not the top, it's not the bottom. He's going to end up saying it's somewhere in the middle. Okay, so, but in a bit of a weird kind of way, and a bit of an incomprehensible way, because there's many different ways of interpreting this line. But Tashma Ditnan says, let's learn it from this Mishna. It says, Harikuva shebagefen. Now, Rikuva could be from laharkiv, grafting. And what we mean is you take a vine, like a shoot from a vine, and then you replant it somewhere else. Let's go with that. Okay, some people think it's talking about the arkuva in the vine, which is the bend in the vine, like a knee is an arkuva. Particularly we use it in animals. We'll talk about in chulin a lot. We get to trefas and things. Eino moded elami karashini. When you go to measure the distance between them, these, like now you have, let's go with the shoot. You took a shoot, you replanted it, so now you have 2. Okay, and they each have their own roots because it took root. So now you have 2 growing. We go, thank you, Terry, 4th century Babylonian Amora. Okay, he was Babylonian, if you remember, but he moves to Israel. Okay, so probably he wasn't with Rav Ashi in this, right? And the answer was not. Okay, in any case, now we get to, what's the Ikar Hashini? When you have the vines growing, so they have like these knots or notches in them. So he says you do it from the second one, okay, which is not the top and it's not the bottom. Okay, so therefore the answer is kind of neither of the options you mentioned. By Rabbi Yirmiya, and thanks for pointing out, yes, Rav Ashi is 7th generation, so there are a few generations apart. By Rabbi Yirmiya, Machar lo shlosha badei ilan mahu. Again, there's many different interpretations. What this shlosha badei ilan is, we'll go with, if you remember we talked about yesterday, what if a sirton came and the soil covers the ground? Okay, so now what if we have 3 trees growing, but they're not really 3 trees. They're 3 parts of a tree that, right, we talked about shoots coming out and then the ground covers them. So what if the 3 trees, this one tree grew, but it's got kind of shoots coming out in 3 different places with their own roots. And now it gets covered up. So you can't see that it all came from one tree. And it looks like 3 different trees. And now I go buy it. So not that it happened after I bought it, but it happened before I bought it. And I buy it and it looks like 3 different trees because the whole bottom part is covered up. So he says, Mahu, what's the story? Is this considered 3 different trees or not? And do I get the land underneath? Amalei Rav Geviha mi beiktil Rav Ashi tashma. Ditnan, let's learn it from here. As it says in the Mishna, Hamavrich shalosh kfanim v'ikarehem nir'im. Rav Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, Omer, Yesh Benhem 408 mitzdarfim v'im lav ein mitzdarfim. So he says, yeah. In fact, the answer is yes, because look at this Mishnah. If you're mavrich shalosh kfanim, if you again take these vine shoots, replant them, and you took 3 of them, and you can see the roots, meaning they each have their own roots. Rabbi Tzadok says, as long as there's 4 amo to 8 cubits between them, we're going to have them be considered as one. And this is already a vine, because remember, you need 5. So this is 6, because it's an even number, because you've done the harkava 3 times. But basically, on 3 vines. So you're going to end up, this is called a vine, as long as it's from 4 to 6. And they'll be mitzdarfim, and if not, not. So what do you see here? Shoots, right? As long as they have their own roots, doesn't matter if they all come from the same source, it's still going to be considered 3 separate ones. And therefore here with the trees, we're also going to consider it 3 separate trees, and therefore you acquire the land underneath. Okay, so now we're going to move on to more questions, but these questions are not going to be answered. Okay, by Rav Papa. If you sold 2 in one field, and you sold me 2 in one field, and you sold me 1 on the border. Now the border with the metzer is a little strip of land that's meant to designate borders. So how do you do that? Well, you either raise it or you lower it, right? It's a little deeper into the ground or it's higher. So now I have 3 trees. 2 are on one area, right? And 1 is a little bit higher than all the others, or a little bit lower. So they don't really look like one field because 1 is on the metzer. Or let's say 2 of you are neighbors, and I bought 1 from you and 2 from your neighbor. And they're all within the space that we need, but they're in 2 different fields. So maybe we wouldn't say I would acquire the land underneath because this is from 2 other people's fields, right? And again, we want this idea that it's kind of like I bought the field, but if it's 2 different fields, you would think maybe not, but it's unclear because in the end I have the right measurements, so maybe. And that's why we end in a teiku. We don't know the answer to this question. Turning now to Abaye. By Rav Ashi, Bor ma'u shetafsik, amat hamayim ma'u shetafsik, Reshut Rabim ma'u, Rifba didikla ma'u. Give 4 examples where Rav Ashi asked, okay, by the way, I was following the chat a little, but I think Rav Ashi is 6th generation, not 7th. Is that correct? Okay, fine. I got confused by your message, so I thought you said it was 7, and I was thinking, isn't it 6? Okay, so Rav Ashi is 6th generation, just to be clear. Okay, remember Rav Ashi is the one who's attributed that he finished the Gemara, kind of sealed it, edited it. Okay, by Rav Ashi, Bor ma'u shetafsik. So now if we have a pit in the middle of the trees, right, in the center there, so would that be considered a separation, right? If we talk about chatzitza, it reminds me a little bit of a chatzitza, like when you go in the mikveh, if you have something blocking. Here, it's not the same thing, but there's something in the middle there. Now, if we're going to say you acquire the area, but there's a pit in the middle of it, maybe that's, maybe that already separates it and says, you're not really getting one field because I'm not getting the bore, so maybe I don't get the field. Or a water channel, also something that's kind of viewed as a separator. Or there's a public domain going through. Okay, this doesn't make any sense because public domain, what's the issue? It's 16 cubits wide. So it can't be a real public domain. They must mean, the commentaries say, it must mean there's a road going through that a lot of people use. Okay, so it's like there's spaces where people just start using it as a road and it becomes a public space, but it's not 16 cubits wide, because if it was, obviously, then there's more than 16 cubits in between the trees, and then we're not talking, that's not relevant. So it's just a space that a lot of people use, which again, kind of creates this separation between the trees. Or richba de dikla. This is a little more hard to understand what exactly they mean, but there's a row of palm trees. Okay, so maybe a row of palm tree stumps, maybe a row of palm trees. Often people use these as a border. I think we had this in another sugya about it being a border. Like there's something, again, this row of trees in the middle of it, mahu. And the answer again is teiku. It's not clear whether these things block it off or whether we say, no, you still acquire the land in between and it's yours, just not obviously that item is viewed as kind of separate. Now we're going to have a question. This is a good lesson in, okay, I'll tell you I like to go through sometimes when I prepare and what I go through to kind of help you understand. So I read this first line and I said, this doesn't make any sense. And like sometimes, when something doesn't make sense in the Gemara, you get stuck on it. I was smart enough to read on to the next line and realize that the Gemara says this doesn't make sense and then edits the question. So when you're learning and something doesn't make sense, sometimes it's because you really don't understand it properly. And sometimes it's because there's actually a mistake. And that's what's going to happen here. So Hillel asked Rebbe the following question. Allah erez beinehem mahu. So the assumption of the way this question sounds, and this is not going to really be the question, but it sounds like if I bought 3 trees and I acquired the land in between, and then Allah erez beinehem sounds like all of a sudden a cedar tree grew in the middle. Mahu, what's the law? So the Gemara says, Allah, wait a minute. If I acquire all the land and a tree just grows on my property, of course it's mine. What kind of a question is that? Allah, birshuta didei nafak. If after I bought the 3 trees, which then means I acquired the land, and a cedar tree grows in the middle, of course it's mine. It's on my property. I own the property now. To which they say, fine, that wasn't the question. Ela haya erez beinehem mahu. If there was a cedar tree already there in the middle, is that considered, like, number one, is it considered as if it's blocked? Like, let's say there's in the middle of these 3 trees that I'm purchasing. I'm buying 3 apple trees. And in the middle, there's a cedar tree. And we didn't talk about the cedar tree. So is it like a board, let's say, that maybe could be considered like it's blocking? Cedar trees were big. So maybe it's considered like this blocks my area and because you weren't selling me the cedar tree. Or does it mean that I acquire the 3 trees, all the ground underneath, and the cedar tree because it's in between? To which he answers, Amarle, in this case, we will have an answer, kana v'kana. Yeah, you acquire the land and you even acquire the cedar tree because it's in the middle of these trees that you're acquiring, which you also get the land, and then you'll even get the cedar tree. So what we talked about before, that maybe you got these small trees that are in the middle, it seems like you could even acquire the big trees that are in there as well. Now we get to a basic machloket that you would have thought they would have started with this. Kitzad hem umdim. How are these trees and what formation are they? Rav Amar kishura. Rav says they're in a row. 1, 2, 3 in a row. Shmuel Amar kechatzuva. And if you were learning any of the Gemaras, they really showed the picture more like Shmuel, which is Shmuel said they're in like a triangle formation. Okay, it doesn't have to be an exact, right? Well, I guess triangles could be shaped differently, but you could basically draw a triangle between them, meaning they're not in a straight row. Now, why is this? So we're going to talk about this. Shmuel holds because if they're in a row, the owner can go and plow in between, which means the owner's not going to want to give up the land so easily because it's plowable land. But if it's a small, it's not such a huge space as it is, and they're in this triangle formation, so I own here, here, and there, and basically you can't get your equipment in because of the 3 trees that I own. They're in a row, you can actually get your equipment through, and therefore, right, remember, there's at least 4 cubits in between. So once there's 4 cubits, they could get through and plow. Maybe the owner isn't giving, because what does it take for me to acquire the land? Well, the owner has to give up their rights. The owner will give up the rights if they don't really need the space. So Rav thinks even kishura, okay? He says even kishura, as long as they're not, right? Let's go with the 8 cubit space, right? They're not more than 8 cubits. We consider these all as one. So now the Gemara is going to say the following: Manda amar kachatzuva val kishura lo. If you have Shmuel and you hold it has to be in a triangle formation, then you're not going to accept Rav's opinion that it could be in a row. My time, mishum de mizdra ben tayu, because the owner can plow and then plant in between. So the owner is not going to give up that land. It's important land for them. But did I skip a line? Manda amar kishura. Sorry, I skipped a line. Manda amar kishura koshaken kachatzuva. But if you say, okay, I just read in the wrong order, but if you say kishura in rows, that's Rav, he would agree with Shmuel that, of course, if it's in a triangular formation, it would also, I would acquire the land, all the more so, because it's more together, right? It's closer to each other. But even kishura, but if you say kechatzuva, I'm now just going in order. If you say kechatzuva like Shmuel, you wouldn't hold kishura. You wouldn't hold it would work if the 3 were in a row, because it's mishum de mizdra ben tayu, because the owner of that field can plant in between and they won't give up that land. So matkefla Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna now has a question and says, wait, Shmuel, lemanda amar kechatzuva, you said kechatzuva my time, and what was the reason? De lo mizdra ben tayu, because you can't plant there. Well, elameata, according to you, right, kishura because Shiur wouldn't work. You wouldn't get the land. Well, what if what if you sold someone these bushes that are thorny bushes? And let's say they're in a row. Now, thorny bushes, the thorns jut out, and you're not going to be able to plant in between them because you're going to get stuck on the thorns. And you can't plant then in between. The owner of that field can't plant. So are you going to say that if they're in a row and they're thorny bushes, you would acquire all the land in between? Based on your logic, that's what you would say. But he doesn't think Shmuel says that, and therefore he's questioning Shmuel's theory. To which, right, he says, Hachanami dieshlo karka, what you're going to say there, you get the land? Amarle, hanach lo chashive, hanach chashive. So Shmuel says, so there's two criteria. It's not just that the owner's not going to be able to plant there. It's also, in order for me to buy these 3 trees and get the land, has to be something of significance. And if it's significant, then I acquire the land, because we call, what's the whole idea? And this goes back to what we talked about earlier. It has to be called a field. Something like thorny bushes, 3 thorny bushes, even if the owner can't plant in between them, who cares? Because it's not called a field. Nobody buys 3 thorny bushes and says, oh, this is a field. That's not a field. So because they're just not significant, I have to buy something significant. That's why I need 3 and not 2, right? There has to be significance to it for it to be considered a field, which means I acquire the land underneath. So it needs 2 criteria according to Shmuel. Both the owner's not going to want to plant there, and therefore they'll give me rights to it, and it has to be significant, and that's why I can basically gain rights to the land as the buyer. Okay, thus ends our sugya, and now we're moving on to Mishna that might be a little unpleasant to those more sensitive or vegetarian vegans, might not like the language of buying animal parts. Hamocher rosh behema gasaf. You sell the head of a large animal. Okay, so now we're going to differentiate between large animals and small animals. If you sell the head of a large animal, lo machar et haraglayim. Okay, the head is a key part of the animal, as are the legs. So therefore, if you sell one part, it doesn't include the other. So machar rosh, you don't get the legs. Machar taraglayim, lo machar tarosh. You sell the legs, you don't get the head. Now you might be thinking, why would you even think so? Well, because we have what's called ikar and tafel, like something that's secondary is often included in a sale, even if you didn't say it, but things that are secondary to that. So if we were to have a relationship where one was kind of secondary to the other, then we would say it was included. By the way, the Tosefta here talks about different language, uses the language of it's all based on minhag hamakom, what people in your area call the sale of a head. If the sale of a head includes the legs, then yes, it would be. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And it really goes by the custom. And it could be the Mishnah agrees with that. And the Mishnah is just talking about the custom that it was in the time and place of whoever the Tana of this Mishnah was. Machar et hakaneh lo machar takaved, because this really seems to be based on what people would normally do. So if you sell the windpipe, which really means the windpipe and the lungs of the animal, lo machar et takaved, it doesn't include the liver. And a sale of the liver, machar takaved, lo machar takaneh, would not include the windpipe and the lungs. Okay, these are, again, 2 separate parts, each one significant in their own right, because this is a large animal. In a small animal, aval b'daka, okay, large animals are like oxen, cows. Small animals are sheep, goats, that kind of family. Aval b'daka, in a small animal, machar tarosh, machar taraglayim. In a small animal, the legs are secondary to the head, and therefore, if you sell the head, it includes the legs. But machar taraglayim, lo machar tarosh. But the legs are not as significant and don't include the head. More like the head is a very significant part. So therefore, if you sell the legs, it doesn't include the head. Machar takaneh, machar takaved, lo machar takaneh. The same relationship between the kaneh and the kaved. The windpipe and the lungs are significant and therefore include the liver also. But the liver is not significant enough. It doesn't include the windpipe and the lungs. So you wouldn't get the lungs if you bought the liver. That's part 1 of the Mishnah. Part 2 really has nothing to do with part 1, except that has to do with sales. Arba midot b'mecholim. This is more going back to our laws of ona'ah and fraud, or really like, when can we say this, I want to change my mind about this deal, the sale, this isn't what I asked for. So arba midot b'mecholim, there's 4 kinds of cases. They're going to divide them up into 4, where you could have a sale and one side or the other, or neither or both. That's what we're going to have, the 4 options. Okay, either the buyer or the seller, either the buyer only, the seller only, both or neither can renege on the deal. So machar lo chitin yafot. I agreed to sell you very nice grains. But it turns out I sold you bad wheat grains, okay? They weren't good quality, and even though I promised you good quality, obviously as the buyer, you can say, hey, I don't want this deal, but I can't because I promised you, right, good, I gave you bad, but I can't say, oh, I want to take back the bad ones. I didn't get cheated in this deal. You got cheated, you can therefore change your mind. If I promised you bad ones, I was selling you, for a cheap price, poor quality grains, and then it turns out I gave you good ones. Now, some commentaries say, what do you mean? What, I didn't know what I was selling you? What do you mean? It turns out. So it could be I sold them in a bag and I didn't look, and I only realized later. It could be I went to a new town and I thought they were bad, but it turns out in that town they were good and they went for a higher price, and therefore I kind of got cheated. Now, it's true I set the price, but I didn't realize. Somehow I didn't know. So I can change my mind and say, I don't want to sell these to you. I realized I made a mistake in the price and in what I gave you. So I can change my mind. You can't, because you got something better. Ra'ot v'nimtzeu ra'ot. Yafot v'nimtzeu yafot. Okay, but if I promised you bad ones and I gave you bad ones, or I promised you good ones and I gave you good ones, well, obviously, right? Everybody got what they were, right? I got the price I was supposed to get, and you got the produce you were supposed to get. No one can change their mind. Case 4, I told you I was selling you darker or black or darker grains, and it turns out, I think they're reddish or so brownish, and it turns out they were white ones, which is different. It's something else. Or I promised you white ones and you got the darker ones. I sold you olive trees. It turns out they were sycamore, or shel shikma v'nimtzu shel zayid. I sold you sycamore. It turns out they were zayid. They were olive. Yayin v'nimtza chometz, wine. And it turns out it was vinegar. Or chometz v'nimtza yayin, vinegar. And it turns out it was wine. Shneim yecholim lachzor b'hem. Because here we're talking about totally different item. Okay, we call this by a different name. It's something else. Okay, even though let's say it's different shades of grain, but it's a different kind of grain. Or it's right, wine and vinegar, but wine and vinegar are different, even if one comes from the other. So, and the tree, obviously, different kinds of trees. So because it has a totally different name, either side can renege on the deal. Okay, we're going to just start the first line of the Gemara now. Amar Rav Chisda, machar lo shaveh chamesh b'sheish. Okay, now we're directly onah. If I sell you something that's worth 5 and I sell it to you for 6, that's a sixth more. That's what we call ona'ah, right? Now, then what happened? So theoretically, I overcharged you. You can renege on the deal. However, in the meanwhile, you didn't renege yet. Vihu karva amad al shmona, and the price goes up to 8. Now I want to renege on the deal because the price just went up and I can get 8 for it instead of the 6 that I overcharged you. Well, minitane lokach, who was the one who was defrauded here? The buyer. Therefore, I can't renege on the deal at this point because I wasn't defrauded. And it wasn't me. I actually did it on you. I overcharged you. I can't now say, because the price went up, oh, I want to renege on the deal. It's too late. The sale was done, right? It's only if it's a complaint of ona'ah. Here, there's no ona'ah, and therefore I can't change my mind. And there we're going to continue this line, even what the lokach can say to me in this case, but we'll see that in tomorrow's daf. Okay, so finished our daf. Let's go back and review. The main thing we started with was this issue of the 3 trees. We were dealing with how much space needs to be between them. We had a long story about that. Each side, right, 2 opinions of Shmuel was a 4. 2 opinions of Shmuel was a 4 to 8 or 8 to 16. Each bringing, right, the Gemara brought proofs for each side. Really, Abaye kind of questioned, Rav Yosef on one, and the Gemara, then Rav Yosef brings support from a story that happened later, not in the Tannaitic time period. And the Gemara says, well, even as a Mishna, to support. And then we even showed that both the minimum and the maximum number can be found in Mishnayot. And then Rava came with this other opinion about that it's 4 to 16, and it includes really all those opinions and brings a braita to support. Then we ended up with our slew of questions about other issues. How do we measure? From which part of the tree do we measure? What if, it's those 3 trees under the ground, really all coming from one tree? Then we have what if it's 2 people, 2 different owners, or it's on the border? What if there's something in the middle? And then we ended with the erez, the cedar tree in the middle of it. And then we had this big machloket, which you would have thought would have come at the beginning, about what formation they're in, row or triangle. The one who said row would agree triangle, but the one who said triangle wouldn't agree row. And then we had a bit of a question on that. What about a thorn bush? And we said, well, there's actually two criteria for Shmuel. Number one, that the person can't plow in between and plant, the owner, and that's why the owner is giving up rights. And because the buyer is getting it all the land because it's something of significance, whereas thorn bushes aren't really significant. And then we just moved on to this last Mishnah about what parts are included in the sale of body parts of animals. What's the difference between a large animal and a small animal? And then we got to these 4 cases where all the options exist of who can renege one side or the other, or neither, or both. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and quiet, safe day.